Good evening, everybody. It's Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. I am Chris Weave, not speaking for my soon-to-be ex-employer. That's foreshadowing. But thank you very much for coming. This is Starfleet Tactical. I am solo tonight. Lissa's taking the night off because she apparently... She told me the story, and it basically was she was up all night working on something game related and then did the game thing and never got a chance to take a nap and decided that she just needed to chill, which is perfectly fine. So she's going to go chill. So a couple of weeks ago, somebody said, hey, show us what your shirt is. So I'm going to show you what the shirt is. It is an Honor Harrington shirt. The front is kind of boring. The back, hopefully you can see because I can't see because I'm turned around. The back has an illustration of one of the missiles. I forget exactly which missile it is, and since I'm wearing the shirt, I can't check. So in any event, tonight, like I said, I'm solo. I'm going to be talking about Chris Moeller's Iron Empires as part of my continuing effort to pull every obscure thing off my shelf and talk to you about it. And now that's actually not what's going on. It just sort of seems that way. What's really going on is that I've got some multi-episode things I want to get done, but I kind of have to get all the way through most of the stuff before I can start putting it all together. And so that's kind of a big effort. I've got some single things I want to do, but the single things I want to do are things that I need somebody else's availability. Like I want to do one on replicators and post-scarcity economy and how everybody gets that wrong. But I really want Andy Presby to be available. So now I'm sort of beholden to his schedule. I want to do one on Franz Joseph Designs, the original Star Trek tech manual, the original blueprints and all that sort of stuff. But I want Pat Doyle to be part of that. And so I've been sort of going through, and it occurred to me, I was just, for some reason, I was reading through some of the Iron Empire stuff because I go back to it periodically. And I said, you know, I really need to do a show on this because it's a really, really cool set of interactions of technology and the tactical situation and the strategic situation, et cetera. And that, of course, is the thing that I really kind of specialize in, right? So that's what I want to do. So that's what we're going to do tonight. So let me go ahead and launch these. Okay. As I said, my employer will disavow all knowledge of my actions. I'm going to go ahead and turn off that banner because it can be distracting. So now that we're done with that, first of all, some scheduling. Now, my scheduling has gotten a little crazy. This is a different schedule than last week you saw, because last week I said basically, aside from the 26th of April, I'm pretty much available. The reason why it's gotten crazy is that I've added a couple of other things onto the schedule, but the real big reason why it's gotten crazy is because, as I mentioned, I am leaving my current job. More specifically, I am retiring from federal service. Yesterday was 20 years of federal service. I am going to retire from the federal government. I'm still planning on working. And I do have another job lined up. We'll see if everything goes through because there's always the possibility. They warned me that if the shit hits the fan, they may have to make some changes. But I'm operating under the assumption that job's going to go through. It's working for a really cool company that I will not tell you about until after I am done working there, because my policy is that I do not speak about my current employer. And in the near term, I'll be able to tell you where I have been working. But the plan is I'm going to retire from my federal job. I'm going to go do something else. I am going to move. I'm going to move about 8 hours away. That means I got to pack. It means I got to do all the other stuff. It means I have to run some errands or locally, and I've already got some stuff scheduled, some trips already scheduled that I'm going to have to work around. So the end result is May is really dodgy as to when I'm going to be available. My expectation is that I won't be available during parts of May, and I will be available during other parts, and I have absolutely no idea how that's going to break out. I just don't know at this point, but I need to figure that out. And the thing I do know is that next week I plan on being available, and the week after that I plan on being available. And then I'm maybe available on the 12th, but probably not, because I'm probably going to go to Iowa on the 12th. And then I know that I'm not available the next week after that because I'm going to be at a science fiction convention, and I'm just going to hang around in Virginia and visit a friend and do some house hunting and stuff like that. So that's what's going on there. In the queue, I've got Jovian Chronicles is one of the things I want to talk about, because it also has some really neat spacecraft technology and things like that that I can talk about. I already talked to you about the replicators and post-scarcity economics. Star Trek Power Systems is an Andy Presby talk, so it depends upon Andy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got lots of things that I can do. The one that I can sort of pull off the shelf pretty quickly is the revised version of Aircraft Carriers in Space. I've done it a couple of times at cons and stuff like that. So I want to take the opportunity to tweak it a little bit more. I'm not totally happy with it. Frequently, I'll do a presentation like 5 or 6 times before I get it to the shape where I really, really am happy with how it goes. So I already said one more time in English, my opinions only, not my employer's. Nothing I say should make you not enjoy something. You should really enjoy Chris Moeller's Iron Empires because it's really cool. Chris Moeller is still alive, and I am interpreting his works for purposes of critique and education, but I have not consulted with him. I do not know him. He may come back and say, yeah, Chris got it all wrong. So just be aware of the fact that I'm interpreting somebody else's works, and they may tell me that I'm totally and completely wrong. And all the images that I'm using are the property of Chris Moeller. Basically, everything came from his stuff this time around. And I'm doing it for critiquing purposes. And in all honesty, I hope you all go out and give him a lot of money. I hope you go out and buy everything in this series, just like I hope you go out and buy all the Steve Galacci stuff for Albedo. And I hope you go and read Outsider. I mean, you can't. I hope you become Patreons of Outsider, because he's also worth supporting. Okay, so let's see. Let me take a look at comments real quick to see if there's anything else. Wright asked the question, anything involving spice mining on Arrakis? No. To be honest, I am less enamored. The older I get, the less enamored I am with Dune. There's things about Dune I really like, but it's kind of one of the things I discover is that if I look at something long enough, I'll get to the point where it's like, I'm not satisfied with it. Why do I like it? I like it for these elements, but I don't like these other elements. So the right answer is that I sort of mentally strip it for parts. And so Dune sort of fits in the mentally stripping it for parts category for me. Oh, no. Now Wright says that he was thinking of my next employment. No, it'll be a wargaming job. It'll almost certain. The job I have lined up is a wargaming job, so I'm not leaving the field. It's nice when you go into an interview, and so as part of the second interview, third if you count HR, talking to the head of HR as being an interview. When I went in for the third interview, which is sort of talking with some of the worker bee level people, this is a company I'm kind of familiar with, like the hiring VP I've known for 15 years. And the other two people in the meeting, I've known one for 20 and the other one for close to 30. In fact, those of you who are veterans of SF Consummel will know him. When I went and had the worker bee level meeting, the one guy says, like, yeah, I was just telling the new people that they should read your article, your essay on wargame pathologies. And so that's not unusual. That's the thing in the wargaming business I'm kind of known for. I had a former coworker from my Intel job call me up because he had gone and taken the Army's wargaming class, and he said, they assign your paper in this class. I had no idea that you were that important. And I said, well, Dan, you should have been paying attention. Okay. Peter Gold asked me if I should do something with the solar clipper. Yeah, Peter, you and I should talk at some point, not this weekend, but you and I should talk at some point about doing a solar clipper show. I think that would be good. Yeah, Stephen Ross also said something about needing an engineering degree to use the vehicle construction system in Jovian Chronicles. I can believe that. Yeah, I can see that. The miniatures game they had, the space combat miniatures game, was kind of that way too, in its own way. Randall Wong says Star Trek replicators good, Stargate replicators bad. Yes, they are. Okay, so off to the show. So here's the agenda and the cover of one of the books. So this is a very similar agenda to what I've done the last couple of episodes for the other properties. First, an introduction. I'll explain to you what it is and sort of how I'm going to go through it, and a little bit of the background just to sort of set the scene. I'm leaving a lot of background out on this one because there's a lot of stuff going on. I'm going to talk about the concept of distortion. Distortion is the technology that they use for their main weapons and for their space drive. So we're going to talk about distortion. We're going to talk about that space drive, same drive for slower than light and faster than light travel. Basically, as the density of the medium gets higher, as more and more particles are in the space, the drive doesn't work as well, and eventually it drops below light speed. So in its own way, it's kind of like stutter warp from 2300, kind of, sort of, maybe, kind of. Talk about tactical space combat. And then I'll talk about operational space combat and the things that go along with that. I'll warn you in advance. This episode is going to have a lot of instances where I'm going to read to you words that are on the slide. There's going to be a lot of, some of these slides are kind of dense with text. And the answer is there's some fantastic explanations that are given, especially in a book called The Bloodstained Stars. In fact, let me go to this. That red book in front, Bloodstained Stars, is a military manual written in universe. So think Machiavelli's The Prince, except in this case, it's about how does combat work. And the idea is that it's a former warlord, a former general, who is currently imprisoned because he was on the wrong side of the Civil War. It was a secession crisis. And so he was on the wrong side of it. And if I remember correctly, that's what happened. Or I think that's how it ended up. To be honest, I couldn't really remember and decided it wasn't worth going back and double checking exactly how he ended up in jail. But he writes this in jail. And sends it off to the sovereign as sort of like, hey, I gave you this thing, you should let me out of jail. And it's sort of considered to be the military manual that everybody quotes from. So it started off as, I think, a Dark Horse comic series that were then later bundled together into these graphic novels. I encountered them as the graphic novels. The first one is Sheva's War. The second one is, I'll forget the name, but I've got it on the next slide. And then the last one is called Void. There's the role-playing game Burning Empires, which is based on Burning Wheel. The total page count on this role-playing game is like 650 some or 640 some pages. It's monstrous. Doesn't have nearly as much background information as you would expect from a game that has a role-playing game that has that many pages. Also, I should say it's like a trade paper size. book. It is not like an 8.5 by 11 size book. So that inflates the page count a little bit, but it's got some really, really cool background, how to create background stuff in it. And then there's this in-universe military manual, and I hope he does more stuff in it. What he's been doing recently is going back and improving the artwork of the original stuff. There was a Kickstarter to basically reissue the first 3 with much more vibrant artwork, and I think he might have even redrawn some of the stuff. He's primarily a comic book guy, and so this is sort of his own thing, but he's done like Justice League and other stuff like that. So it's really, really good. And so, as I said, 3 graphic novels: Faith Conquers, Sheva. Faith Conquers is the first one. Sheva's War is the second. Void. Then Bloodstained Stars. About half of Bloodstained Stars is about Space Navy stuff. About half of it is about the ground stuff. So this presentation is about the Space Navy stuff. I'm really going to ignore the ground combat. And most of it comes from Bloodstained Stars, because it is the manual where the in-universe author is explaining how the world works, which is really useful for me, who wants to explain how the world works, right? And with some backup stuff from Void, because Void is the one that has space combat. The other 2 are basically ground pounder stuff. The Void has space combat. I don't want to make it sound like it's all combat, because it's not. There's lots of political intrigue. There's lots of, nobles going around stabbing each other in the back, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not actually going to quote really from the Burning Empires RPG much at all. If you want to get into the details of like how the Civil War happened, how the Civil War happened that ended the Empire, that's all in there. That's all laid out there. Everything else is sort of done in universe, and it's just like people that have just lived with it for a couple of 100 years. That's the one that sort of explains how the fall happened. Okay, so the background for this universe is that it is a time of decline. The Federated empires have collapsed due to a succession crisis and a civil war. There's now 8 feudal iron empires, that's what they're called, have arisen in their place, covering only a fraction of the former imperial space. Basically, it's the core sector. If that sounds familiar, like it's kind of Battletech-ish, yeah, it's kind of Battletech-ish. Chris Moeller says, I think it might be the intro to Bloodstained Stars, or in the intro to one of them, he basically says, yeah, I grew up on Traveler. I grew up on Heinlein and Starship Troopers. He's got powered armor in this. I grew up on these things, etc. So you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to spot the influences of Traveler in this, and other gaming things like the Battletech Fallen Empire thing looks pretty good. It also reminds me a lot of Fading Suns, if you remember that RPG. It sort of has some of the same feel as Faded Suns. The reason why it's only a fraction of the former space is in part because it just all fragmented. But it's also the case that there's this alien called the Valen that are referred to as the Worm. They're a worm-like parasitic intelligence. And they, like the Goa'uld or the Trill or whatever, they take you over. And they are not really sentient by themselves, but if they manage to lodge in a human brain, they go from this semi-sentient, cold, logical, not particularly bright thing to something that can experience emotions and have true sentience, etc. And so they really get off on taking human hosts, and they've been slowly but surely moving forward, and that there's a sense of impending doom that's taking place. In fact, in Bloodstained Stars, he talks about how, the Valen are running their own empire, and they have they still run the empire, their empire, like the old days. They've got tankers, they got fleets, they got everything that they can do, all the capabilities, etc. And that we should go and raid the Valen, not to rescue the people because they're beyond redemption at this point, but because they've got our libraries. All of the knowledge that we've lost, all the technology that we've lost, they've still got. So we should go and steal We should steal our stuff back from them, and then we should nuke them out of existence. Good luck with that. Let's see if you can pull that off. So this is a universe where resources, technology, ships, etc., is very limited. It's also very BattleTech-ish. People are not able to they're barely able to maintain the things they have. In fact, if there's this great quote from Bloodstained Stars, the golden matrix of 1,000 strategies, he never explains what this is, other than apparently everybody would know about it, contains, by my count, some 632 strategies that simply cannot be executed with the technology and forces available to any commander now alive. That's in a section where he's that's not the only document that he sort of quotes, where he says, like, yeah, in their time period, they could make the assumption that they had these fleets and they had tankers and they had this and they had that. We don't have any of that stuff. So the old ways don't work anymore. And so we've got these new ways. And you also get all these hints about, why they don't work anymore. And part of it is they're just too busy being knights on horseback rather than being disciplined Roman legionnaires. And I'll point out a quote on that when I get to it. Okay, so a little terminology just to sort of let you know, because I'm going to make the reference to hammer. There's a couple of orders of nobility. There are the Lords of the Hammer. That's one of the noble orders. And those are lords that control space forces. And then there are Lords of the Anvil, and they control ground forces. And if you are sufficiently rich and powerful enough that you control both space forces and ground forces, you are known as a forged lord. And you belong to both noble orders. You are a knight in good standing or a noble in good standing in both of those orders. Now, even Lords of the Hammer have like base security and stuff like that. They're not talking about things like that. They're not talking about constabulary forces. What they're talking about is ground combat forces. They're talking about armies. They're talking about tanks. They're talking about things like that. They're talking about powered armor in significant scales, organized to fight wars. They will refer to lesser nobility. They are often referred to as Lord's Pilot of the Hammer or Lord's Pilot of the Anvil. That just means that they are not a lord that controls like ducal estates or anything like that, but they are of the noble class. And they frequently, especially if they're a ground guy, but even for like if you're a fighter or gunship guy, you might have a crucis, which is a brain machine interface. And they have, you can tell the guys that have a crucis because their heads are shaven in a particular way, and you can sort of see where the connection points are. I'm not going to discuss ground combat. I said that. I'm not going to discuss court politics. I'm not going to go into. He spends a lot of time talking about press gangs and when you should use them and why you should do them lightly and when you shouldn't use them and stuff. I'm not going to get into all that stuff. I think that's kind of over the top. And the ground combat stuff alone. I mean, there's more stuff in this background on ground combat than there is on naval combat. There's a lot of stuff on naval combat. In the ground combat stuff, even though there's two graphic novels that are sort of about ground combat people, they don't spend a whole lot of time doing ground combat. Void is specifically about a guy who is leading an expedition, a crusade with a squadron of ships. And so there's a little bit of stuff on the ground having to do with court politics, but most of that takes place as he's telling the story to his son of what happened on this expedition. So it's about 50-50 as to ground versus naval. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about distortion. And this is the first of those slides where I'm basically just going to read you a bunch of stuff. I'll try to explain it then. The two critical technologies are, of course, the hyper-expansion drive, that's the STL-FTL drive, which makes possible faster than light travel, and the Q-beam, which strikes the enemy with a force and at ranges no mere fusion gun can match. And they talk about those are called they're also known as the distortion drive. I'll use the terms interchangeably, and the distortion cannon. So Q-beams are distortion cannon. Hyper-expansion drive is distortion drive. There's a couple of different flavors of that, which I'll talk about. Both these technologies in turn operate on the principle of distortion, hence the alternative names distortion drive and distortion cannon. Yeah, I forgot that quote was there. That is, they alter the physical constraints, constants of our universe in a localized area. The hyper-expansion drive does so in a carefully controlled fashion to permit one's own ship to attain superluminal speeds. The Q-beam does so in a catastrophically uncontrolled fashion to drown an enemy's ship in antimatter. And it talks about how it creates particles and antiparticles, and they're sort of held in suspension until the beam sort of lets it go, and then it goes boom, and it's a very, very big boom. Now, the distortion effect only works perfectly in perfect vacuum, and perfect vacuum does not exist. Even in the deepest void between the stars, some scattered atoms of hydrogen interfere, and the closer one approaches it to any particular system, the more densely space is soon with cosmic dust captured by its gravity. So that's important. If I talk about dust, I'm talking about particles, I'm talking about elemental atoms of, hydrogen, etc., or if you're close enough to a planet, like if you're in low Earth orbit, you've got oxygen, radical oxygen and stuff like that. All those ions, all that stuff, I'll just refer to those as particles or dust. And they are logically, they collect in gravity wells. So the sun pulls them in, planets pull them in, et cetera, et cetera. So the density of the medium varies a great deal. Increasing density of matter progressively reduces the efficiency of distortion, forcing ships to travel at ever slower speeds until distortion fails altogether and they must rely on conventional thrusters and conventional weapons. That's a big deal. There's another little bit I'm going to talk about in just a second, that when you combine all that stuff together, it leads to a really seriously interesting tactical situation. The way the technology dictates. Tactics are always dictated by technology. The principles of strategy are everlasting. It's about how to think about the use of resources and how to think about prioritizing targets and, figuring out the other guy's center of gravity, et cetera, et cetera. That stuff is timeless. Tactics are heavily dependent upon technology. Like, for instance, the tactics of the Age of Sail and the tactics of the Dreadnought era are dramatically different. You have battle lines in both cases, but other than that, it's entirely different, and that's because of the technologies involved. This distortion stuff, in my mind, is reminiscent of the real pseudoscience, and I'm aware of the weirdness of the idea of real pseudoscience, which is called torsion fields. And like a lot of the UFO people, Bob Lazar talks about torsion fields and stuff like that. And I've never gotten a good wrapped my head around torsion fields. The Wikipedia article is sort of not particularly good about explaining what the pseudoscientific claim is, other than that supposedly it allows the faster than light transmission of information and data and other things like that. And they make the argument that this is where ESP and all these other things come from. I don't have a good understanding of the real pseudoscience of torsion fields. Okay, so here's the space drive. Now, Chris Moeller had a blog. He posted like 5 times to the blog. The most recent post was in like 2013. That chart on the right is one of the posts to the blog. I'm okay with him only posting the number of times he posted because he gave me that chart, and that chart is incredibly useful. And I'm going to have to put that chart on my big monitor because I can't read it on the small monitor, which means I'm going to look like I'm staring up into the sky while I'm reading this because my camera is down here and my monitor's up here. Okay, so you've got 2 different types of space drives. You got the hyper expansion drive that I talked about earlier, the distortion drive, and that's got a maximum speed of about 50 light years a week. There's also something called the Bernhardt compression drive, which is, they don't explain exactly what it is, other than it is another type of distortion drive. It's just not the hyper expansion drive. It can be put on smaller ships, and it can get you dramatically increased speed, up to 180 light years a week, but at the cost of it just gulps down fuel. It is really, really fuel intensive. And I think if I remember correctly, it only works on smaller ships, and you eventually get to the point where it doesn't work. It's either that or it's just too fuel intensive on big ships for you to do that. Fuel is a big deal in this universe. But as the dust density increases, the advantages disappear. So you eventually get to the point where the Bernhardt drive is still gulping down fuel, but it's no more efficient than a regular hyperexpansion drive. And so the Bernhardt drive is a specialty drive. You use it for couriers, you use it for scouts, and you don't use it for anything bigger than that because it's just too fuel intensive and you're always going to be fuel limited. Both of the drives are affected by particle density. And as the chart on the right shows, as you go from the interstellar medium to orbital space, you have more material present, and you eventually fall out of hyperexpansion and you can only do sublight. And then eventually you get to the point where you can only use conventional thrusters. Now, he never explains what conventional thrusters are. I am assuming that since there are fusion weapons, that conventional thrusters are fusion drives. But he doesn't actually say that. I think it's a good assumption. There's similar but not exactly the same restrictions on Q-beam fire. As you can see, that orange band is Q-beam fire. And Q-beam fire, when you fire it, it basically fires like through hyperspace, I guess, something like that, and causes a big explosion at the target location. So those of you who are role-playing gamers are probably thinking, Meson guns. There's a lot of similarities with Meson guns. And remember, he's an old Traveler player. He's actually about a year older than I am. So he's easily old enough to remember original Traveler. In fact, he talks about little black books. He's also old enough to remember Space Opera from Fantasy Games Unlimited, which had a weapon called a Nova gun, which really did fire through hyperspace. And at some point, I should probably talk about that because Nova guns are interesting because the thing about most weapons that fire through space is because you're not on a two-dimensional surface throwing stuff through the third dimension. A laser moves through the space directly to the target, right? A beam weapon goes through the space directly to the target. So if you're anywhere along that path of that beam, you hit. Whereas an artillery shell, or even including naval artillery shells, are, of course, they're being fired at a particular point. They'll go over stuff. Lasers go through stuff. Artillery goes over stuff. That's a bigger deal than it first sounds like, because that's what means you have to get the range correct. With lasers, maybe there's some focusing gimmick that you can do that you'd kind of like to know the range. Maybe you might make a decision about whether or not you're going to fire. It's useful to know the range, to have an idea of how much jinking the guy can do, to know what your light speed lag is. But really, when push comes to shove with a laser, I'll just point it to where I see him and turn the firepower knob up all the way, put all the energy I can into it. And if I'm wrong on the range, I'll still do damage, right? Doesn't matter what the range is. Artillery is much different than that. I gotta get the range right, more or less. If a ship is tall enough, I could, be aiming to go over it and maybe hit the superstructure instead of hitting at the waterline. But more or less, it's a point weapon. And Nova guns are a point weapon, and Q-beams are a point weapon. You got to get the range correctly. And I'm not going to talk about sensors in this talk, but he doesn't say a whole lot about it, but he does have like a paragraph or two where he talks about how important it is to have good people on sensors, because the sensor people can figure that stuff out, and you need them to do your fire control. I totally agree with all that. So in any event, that's how distortion technology works, and how the varying densities work to cause your distortion technology to sort of collapse down to the point where it no longer works. And we're going to come back to the ideas inherent in this chart later on. Okay, so a few quotes on fuel and on time and distance. Here is the paradox of the hyperexpansion drive. Only in the hardest of interstellar vacuum is the density of matter low enough for a hex ship to reach full speed, but at such speeds, a ship will soon run out of fuel, and in deep space, there is nowhere to get more. Only at worlds with liquid water or gaseous hydrogen can a ship refill its tanks, and it is precisely in the dust-laden space around such worlds that it must move most slowly. This is an interesting trade-off, right? And it also tells you some things about how this drive works. It strongly implies at least, that fuel consumption is linked to distance, not linked to distance or speed, which in this case is kind of the same thing, not linked to the amount of time you're running the drive. The implication is, if I'm going really fast for 5 hours, or if I'm going in the inner system and my distortion is heavily limited for 5 hours, you would think that if just what's going on is that I'm limited and I've got the speed governor, but my engine is revving the same, that I would be using the same amount of fuel. But that's not what this says. This tells me that either the engine, that the physical effect is that it prevents the engine from running, prevents it from revving, it prevents it from being at high performance levels, or it just means that it's really just based on distance. Not sure which one, but they kind of have the same effect. So the physics of the hyperexpansion drive restrict the volume of space that any one person can control, like a lord, to roughly a single sector of space, a mere 200 light years on a side. The limiting factor is not just the speed at which the fast couriers can carry orders across such distances, but the speed at which battle cruisers can enforce those orders, for an order is mere words without the force to back it up. Okay, makes sense. From a threatened planet on the borders of a given sector, a high-speed courier can carry word of an invasion or a revolt to the central worlds, 100 light years distance, in about 4 weeks. But a combat squadron sent from the center to quell the threat will take easily twice as long, that is, 2 months or more. Now, the reason why the words 4 weeks are in red is because I looked at that and went, that math doesn't work out. I was told that it's like 180 light years per week. Why doesn't that work out? And I came to the conclusion that, first of all, okay, maybe you can do it faster in some instances, but it's probably a fuel limitation thing, right? You probably have to refuel multiple times. And as a result of that, that's, this isn't just 4 weeks of pedal to the metal the entire time. It's 4 weeks of practical distance. Even the Pony Express had to change horses. Even the Pony Express, occasionally, the riders had to sleep occasionally. This does beg the question, why don't they have something like the X-Boat network, right? Why does the courier have to come in? Why don't you have a courier waiting, full tanks, crew on board, just ready to take the message to the next stop, and then you can refuel at your leisure and be prepared to head back? My guess is the answer is they just don't have enough ships and enough resources to make that work. That's the sort of thing those old empires that had lots of resources do that the Iron Empires wouldn't do. You may give an order to your courtiers, great prince, and see them scurry to obey it at once, and yet between an event transpiring in your frontier and your response to it, 3 months may well elapse. Okay, so now let's talk about tactical space combat. The right is a drawing from Bloodstained Stars. It's clearly just Chris Moeller sort of doodling out what the ships look like. I will admit, I am not the biggest fan of his ship designs. These are some of the ships that were actually used. You see ships that look just like this in Void. They're kind of blocky, and you can see that there's engines on the back. Ships are often described in terms of how many engines they have. Like in Bloodstained Stars, he talks about your noble father acquired 2 freighters. I think it was in Bloodstained Stars. 2 freighters, which also had some tanking capability, one of which was a 4-drive ship, one was a 5-drive ship. And the 5-drive ship carried less as a result of having that extra drive, but would be faster, right? So that previous stuff about hyperexpansion drives, he doesn't talk about the various number of engines and how that affects speed, but it's kind of implied in Void. It's definitely talked about in Void about how that affects things, but I don't have numbers to go with it. Starship combat always takes place at STL speeds. It's slower than light speeds. And that's because at FTL, you can't hit anything. The ships are just moving too fast. You can't do the precision to get, I mean, you'd have to lead it and you'd have to get it exact. And even though the weapons are incredibly powerful, I'll talk about that, it just doesn't work out. The math doesn't work out. And so you don't actually see that. I'm going to talk about weapons, armor, and different types of warships next. Okay, so weapons. First of all, let's start with Q-beams. They're the long-range weapon. They're very clearly the long-range weapon. I believe it is a faster than light weapon, but I'm not positive about that. He doesn't really say. And it creates the distortion of field effect at the point of impact, not the point of firing. This is really, really important because it means you can be down in the muck. You can be down in the dust-heavy areas, and you can still fire your guns out at people who can't shoot back at you. We'll talk more about this later. Let us lodge ourselves firmly inside the Terminator, the hazy edge of the gravity well, where our moving distortion drives couldn't stabilize, but their Q-beams snapping open for an instant might still do their lethal work. This is from Void from the comic. Each Outraider Q-beam ripped open a 15-meter distortion field with less than 20 degrees of emergence. Not quite sure how to process those numbers, but I left them in case you guys figure it out. Within those fatal zones where the value of time was reduced nearly to zero, every atom met its antimatter twin. Tens of thousands of antimatter annihilations held in stasis until the field collapsed, simultaneously releasing their combined fury. One Q-beam event can throw off an expanding shell of gamma radiation that's lethal thousands of kilometers away. And then later on, as in the description text, he says, the Q-beams triggered less than 1,000 kilometers beneath her, close enough to count as direct hits. If you miss by 1,000 kilometers, it's considered a direct hit. That's how powerful these things are. This is several orders of magnitude above nuclear weapons. Several orders of magnitude. Okay. You also have fusion cannon. They're a short-range weapon. They're used only in orbit. They're only used in places where you can't use distortion cannons. So we'll get back to that. There are some ships that are specifically armed with fusion cannon because they're brawlers. They're designed to go down in the well and get into a slugging match. And then you have a weapon called nails. They're actually a missile. They're designed to disrupt a distortion drive. And basically you fire this thing at a ship and it buries itself in. It just sticks in. And it carries a gravitic fluctuation device in its warhead, which it embeds as deeply as possible in the hull of the targeted ship. To further impede removal, many nails also scatter cluster munitions or even have automated anti-personnel beams to keep damage control crews at bay. So, yeah, this is one of those backgrounds where people go out in spacesuits on the hull of the ship to do shit in the middle of a battle. So David Drake had some of those. Some other people have those. It's like, usually it's an Age of Sail metaphor when they do that. But, and there's sort of the implication later on when they talk about borders and capturing ships that you can have like sometimes the battle takes place on the hull of the ship in order to try to protect the airlocks. It's like, okay, that's kind of crazy, but whatever. Nails are a niche weapon, falling far short of Q-beams in range and subject to being intercepted or shot down short of their target. They are thus best used against civilian vessels or against warships that are already damaged. And so we see that in Void. Ship is damaged, it gets hit by nails, and now it can't escape, right? Even if they fix the damage control, they get their internals back to the point where they can run away. They still have to go out and deal with all the nails, and even one nail is enough to keep them from being able to get their distortion drive to work and for them to be able to jump away. And so they're kind of stuck at that point. All right, let's talk about armor. Armor in this universe is an active setting. It's a grid that contains a dense, super dense substance and sort of heat channeling portions of it. So high index technology called a power armor grid. And the powered armor, not to be confused with powered armor suits. In fact, he specifically says, I got power armor and power armor. In the powered armor of spacecraft, webs of highly emissive materials connect superdense armor plating. When activated, the component atoms of that section of the grid go positive, increasing the binding strength of the strong nuclear force and making it thousands of times denser, while the surrounding emissive materials, by going positive, channel heat away from the impact site and disperse it efficiently. Some so-called civilian hammercraft even have energy-diffusing powered armor, though the masters of such expensive ships are often well-connected and willing to part with their crew. So that's part of the don't press gang these people part. But he talks about civilian hammer ships that are like nobles might have a ship like that as their yacht or something like that. So they're ships that are sort of equipped as if they're military ships. They've got some of the good stuff, but they're not really military. Armor can be damaged and overloaded. In fact, this is from Void. At one point, our armor grids are at capacity. We only have 5 minutes of full acceleration before eternal heat goes critical. So they got heat sinks. Remember I said I think that he also paid attention to Battletech? They've got heat sinks and they're worried about armor. This also reminds me of a couple of other things. It reminds me of polarized hull plating in Star Trek Enterprise. And it reminds me of the valency generators in Peter Hamilton's Night's Dawn trilogy. So they had something like this in the armor that can muck with the strong nuclear force to hold the atoms together better. Although in that case, they specifically called them valency generators. So I guess it must be doing something with electrons. In fact, I should probably... The Night's Dawn trilogy is 3,300 books, 3,300 pages plus of science fiction with a lot of spacecraft and a lot of interesting technologies and things like that. So I should add that to the list of things I talk about also. I have to reread it. It's really long. Oh, well, I'm willing to jump on the grenade for you folks. Okay, so cruisers are ships. That's a armored cruiser there. He never really explains what an armored cruiser is versus other types of cruisers. And that reminds me, I'm going to go back for a second because I meant to talk about that here. At some point, I'm going to talk about the different types of ships. I'm going to do sort of a history of ships. And one of the things I'm looking forward to is the very interesting time period of the 1800s. The 1800s is the time period where you had, at one point, the largest ship in the Royal Navy was a frigate. Why was that? Well, it was an armored frigate with steam power, and they called it a frigate because it had a single deck of guns. And then they said, this doesn't make any sense that we're calling this a frigate, and they threw out their old rating system. They invented a new one. You also have protected cruisers, which meant it had a particular type of armor pattern. And you had unprotected cruisers, which meant it had no armor pattern. And then you had armored cruisers, which were, in general, later than protected cruisers. They had a different type of armor pattern. And in general, they were an improvement over protected cruisers. But you did occasionally have people building improved protected cruisers later on that were better than earlier armored cruisers. It's really complicated. And it's also utterly fascinating, both in and of itself as naval history, and because I can envision all sorts of ways to run it through the science fiction converter. So one way you could run this through the science fiction converter is, rather than sort of treat it as just the type, the arrangement of the armor, maybe some of this is about what type of armor you have. And you see this, I think, in Stellaris, if I remember correctly. I don't play Stellaris, but I know a reasonable amount of, I know more about Stellaris than most people who don't play the game would know about Stellaris. And I believe that they have this thing where you can either buy shields or you can buy armor, or you can buy both. And certain weapons are, shields are effective against some weapons and armor is effective against other weapons. And so if you know what the other guy's buying, then that sort of might affect what you equip your ships with. And there's a lot of rock, paper, scissors stuff going on. And it's also really fascinating from that standpoint. But I can easily think of a situation where maybe I have passive armor, active armor, and shields. And so maybe if I've got shields, I decide I don't need to spend a whole lot of technology in this, because this stuff can get damaged and it has to be repaired. And it's not just a matter of like pouring some molten armor material to fill a hole or something like that. That's a machine. I have to fix the machine that is my armor. I want to do something with it. That strikes me as being complicated and hard to do. But, hey, I can easily see having passive and active, and then maybe some ships have no armor and some ships have screens, et cetera, et cetera. So when we get to armored cruisers, we're going to, and protected cruisers, et cetera, et cetera. When I do history of warships, we're going to talk about things like that. Okay, so back to large ships. Cruisers are the bulk of the battle fleet. And he talks about a couple of different kinds of cruisers. Now, I'll note, do you see battleships here anywhere? You don't see battleships anywhere. You go back here, oh, look, there's a dreadnought, and there's a battleship. He never talks about dreadnoughts or battleships. I don't know if that's because, it's from the same book. You'd think that they would include that. In fact, I believe they even talk about in the in-universe editor's introduction, that the artwork was done under the direction of the guy. He didn't do the drawings himself, but he had a friend of his was there and he did all the sketching. And so he should talk about battleships and dreadnoughts, but he doesn't talk about those. I can't remember if they're in Void. But he does talk about patrol cruisers, escorts, or sometimes frigates, as they're essentially the same thing. I think it's different. The different empires call them different things. And they have 1 or 2 Q beams, and they have low-grade power armor grit because they're basically expendable, and they're mostly about commerce raiding and protecting convoys and stuff like that. Those aren't really the line of battleships. The line of battleships are heavy cruisers and battle cruisers. And heavy cruisers have 3 or 4 Q beams, and battle cruisers have 5, 6, or even more, unquote, Q beams. And they also have correspondingly elaborate power grids. And so those are the real warships that you're going to fight battles with. And the only thing that you really see is that battle cruisers are bigger. There's not this implication of trading speed for armor that I've been able to find anywhere in here, which is, that's fine as long as you're consistent. Cutters are any ship lacking fuel capacity for true interstellar travel. And then he talks about monitors as being one of those things, and they have some special categories, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit more, he makes this sort of very specific statement about that, and then it doesn't quite play out the way you would want to, because if I read something like that, I would expect that there might be heavy cruiser or battle cruiser type cutters, but there aren't. Now, the explanation he gives for why you would do this is the same as you get for Traveler battle riders, and that is, if I'm not carrying around in this case, fuel tankage. In Traveler, it was a jump drive, but in this case, it's fuel tankage. If I'm not carrying around fuel tankage, I can carry around more weapons. I can carry around more armor. But he specifically says building a cutter with armament any heavier than 2 Q-beam cannon is a waste of resources. Okay, so they're not quite like the old type battle riders in Traveler. He talks about monitors, which are like that, but they're for use in the close space. They're for use in that when you start getting deep into the gravity well. And he doesn't, I can't remember if he explains what a Sargasso is, other than I think it's one of those areas that has a lot of stuff in it, like a Lagrange point, for instance, where stuff has a tendency to collect, and as a result, you can expect that the dust of the interstellar medium or the interplanetary medium will be heavier there. And as a result, your Q-beams aren't going to work, and your distortion drive isn't going to work. And so there's areas of sort of local concentrations, and gravity wells are one of them, and just sort of other weird places are another. And in those places, you don't have Q-beams or distortion drives. And he describes them as being more like slow-moving, not slow-moving warships, but really movable fortresses. And they use fusion guns, and they have lots of armor, and they just go, and it's all about short-range body blows. It's all about going and slugging it out. So those are very specialized ships designed to either defend their orbital defenses, or they're designed to go down into the muck. And they're carried by these things that they call carriers that will carry them, have the fuel capacity and dump them out, and then they sort of crawl their way in. He specifically says at let's see how exactly did he phrase it? He specifically said that it's really expensive to send cruisers deep into gravity wells because they're not equipped for it. They're just not. Even if you're still outside that range, their cruisers are a hard press to get in because they've devoted so much of their mass to fuel tankage. They're dangerously fragile against most of the defenses that you would see deep in a system. And so you kind of need to have this specialized force to go do this, which in turn means, like, if you're just like in Void, it's a raiding force. They're not intending to sort of land troops. They're not intending to crack any fortresses. They're not intending to take over any planets. They're just intending to go and screw with the other guys, raid his forces, raid his merchants, et cetera, teach him a lesson. And so that type of fleet is organized quite differently than a fleet that is going to go do a planetary assault. Okay. Small ships are oftentimes used in close space work, so those are the guys that you might send small ships down into the well when you wouldn't send big ships, because you can afford to lose small ships. This is sort of like, it's interesting. It would be interesting to sort of take the Corbett model of the flotilla and the battle fleet and the cruising force, and in fact, I should do this. I should go and take that model and apply it here and see how the model changes based upon what Chris Moeller has done. The small ships that are not the ones that go down into the well oftentimes have Bernhard drives, because they let them be a lot faster and they can be good scouts. You have specifically of gunships that are kind of a small version of a monitor. They do have a distortion drive to sort of get them into place, but they're basically they're not quite fighters. He doesn't describe them as being fighters. I think they have more than one crew, but they are small ships. And he says, gunship pilots must be bold to the brink of madness, my lord, to face off against greater vessels in such lightly armored craft. To survive, let alone prevail, they must strike fast and then fall back even faster. A gunship that stands and fights does not last long. Properly used, my lord, gunships are a flashing rapier that dazzles the foe, but oh, they are lethally easy to misuse. Nothing kills more gunship pilots than a romantic overestimation of their capabilities. Seeded through a system using gravity wells and sargassos as a sanctuary from the enemy battle fleet, gunships can ravage the foe's supply ships and force him to disperse his fighting squadrons to act as escorts. But gunships caught outside close space can be swatted whole squadrons at a time by even near misses from a Q-beam. Though youth may believe otherwise, no amount of skill or daring can compensate for sheer lack of armor. That's really interesting. I'm going to try to remember to talk about this when I get to Traveler, because one of the things that Martin Doherty talks about in Traveler is that if you use your fighters to go fight a fleet action, you're going to get a lot of pilots killed. That fighters are not for fleet action. They're for doing things like this. And they're for smaller stuff. They're for being on the periphery of a battle, not going in for the kill, which is entirely different than what you see fighters like in World War II. And remember how I talked fighters in World War II were really the ammunition of a carrier, and they had a lot greater range. These things don't have a greater range. They're limited to a very small area. It's weird. The fighter-like thing in this thing specifically has a very short range as opposed to a much longer range. Skillfully employed gunships can shut down a vessel by their very presence, maneuvering so closely to their prey that their mass prevents its distortion drive from engaging. Now, like next sentence that I didn't include here says, but that's really, really dangerous. And that's a good way to get your gunship killed. So, and so he basically says, you do that temporarily so that you can get a nail into him, and then you run away before he kills you. Okay, he does talk about specialized ship. Here's a tanker fueling some cruisers. Most Hammer Lords have few tankers or none at all. They basically get them on the open market. Mercators are standard merchant ships, sometimes configured for combat support. They're also usually hired. So you might have a couple, but you need to go and pay somebody to come and fuel your stuff and bring you supplies. You've got outraiders, which are basically raiding forces that are basically mercenaries, privateers. You can think of them as privateers. You've got fortresses that, because Q-beams can shoot out and make it tough to raid or refuel. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more going down. And he also talks about dark ships, which are ones that specifically are designed to lower their emissions, and so they're harder to find. He goes out and he goes on and says, yeah, you'd only use that on small ships because a big ship, once it starts firing at weapons and using active sensors, you're going to spot it right away. So why would you make that stealthy? Well, okay, I'd make it stealthy so that when I fired my weapons, I was a lot closer. I had snuck up on the guy. So I could see it either way. Makes me wonder if there's something missing in that explanation, that there's an assumption that Chris Moeller is making that he did not articulate to the rest of us. Oh, here, remember when I said that it shows in this book that their attitudes are one of the reasons why they aren't as good as they used to be? Here's the example. No Lord pilot with the faintest ember of warrior spirit in his soul would accept command of ships unable to win glory in battle or profit in raiding. How about ships that are essential to win the war? Maybe they would accept command of a ship that is essential to win the war. But, this is all about profit and glory. This is the reason why these guys can't get their act together. So this is out of the back of Void. And what I think we're seeing here, I mean, it's hard to read on this slide. He shows you the size of the ships, and there's some specific information where he sort of graded them. I'll show you the grading scheme on the next slide. Those are names of people in the crew. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be the entire crew. I am 99% sure, 95% sure that the names there are the Kickstarter supporters when he did this. I think that's how the Kickstarter supporters got included. They got assigned to the crew of a ship, probably based upon the amount of money they'd given them. But look at the size of some of these ships. And you've got a battleship there, and you've got a dreadnought there. So those missing ships are here. They're not listed in Bloodstained Stars, but they're listed in Void. And that dreadnought is a kilometer long. The battleship is half a kilometer long. Battle cruiser is only a little bit less than that. So that's the approximate size of those ships. We also have here the order of battle for the fleet that took place in it, in the text box down below. If you want to blow it up later, come back and look at it and blow it up. He talks about how it's a raiding force, and as a result, it didn't have any anvil forces along. It was just intended as a raiding force. But that's basically what the order of battle was. And here we have sort of the sector of space that they were doing stuff. So if you read through the comic, some of the words there are words that you'll see in the comic. And these are also from the back of Void. And Void's the graphic novel I was referring to there. Okay, so let's talk about operational space combat. I'm going to talk about fortresses, logistics, and maintenance. And we have here some guys on the surface of a ship. They're basically getting ready to take a prize ship. And it's unclear to me as to whether they've actually taken the prize ship or not, and they're prepared to defend it against people trying to take it back, or whether they're getting ready to go inside. But I thought that was a nice piece of artwork that kind of showed you that. It's a little bit blurry because it just the resolution wasn't real great when I took it. Okay, fortresses are, he talks about they're really part of an integrated space defense. And he's talking about actual installations on planets, but that in order for that planetary installation to work, with it's got a central keep and it's got tunnels going out, but it also have to have sensors around the entire planet so somebody doesn't sneak up on you from the backside of the planet. And it really covers the entire solar system. You need sensors out in the solar system, you need picket chips, you need all these other things to feed information to the fortress. The fortress has Q-beams because Q-beams can shoot out through the atmosphere because it's about where the distortion effect comes out. It's not about where it's created. So they can shoot out, but you have to come in with fusion and weapon and nuclear weapons and stuff like that to actually get to the fort. In fact, you probably have to land ground forces and do a ground assault. So you can shoot out of the gravity well, but not into it. It's not really the gravity, it's the particle density of the gravity well. And you're on the surface of the planet, and he can't shoot back into the atmosphere. It's not quite like Meson guns in Traveler, or even Nova Cannon in Space Opera. Meson guns in Traveler, you can bury it underground, and it will fire through the rock because it's firing through hyperspace. This thing has a gun silo with a turret or something at the top that actually points the weapon in the direction you want to fire. So you have to at least get up to the atmosphere, I guess. But as a result, it's potentially vulnerable. So it's got powered armor just like ships do, except this powered armor is a lot bigger, has a lot more power behind it. It's a lot thicker. And you build this thing like on an island or next to a convenient ocean, so that you can use the ocean as a heat sink. And he talks about how at some point he says, as you because of leaching minerals from the heavy metals and stuff like that, you really only want to do this with planets that either have really robust ecologies or planets that are expendable and you don't care if you screw up their ecology by putting a fortress there. And so why would you have fortresses? Fortresses are places where you can come and get fuel, and they're places where the other guy can't get fuel. If you know that there's a fortress there, he can't raid you for fuel. So in Bloodstained Stars, he says, a properly layered defense of the kind I have outlined requires considerable time and effort to grind down. Ultimately, a well-built fortress cannot be destroyed from space unless the attacker resorts to flinging asteroids at the planet in question. Yep, he's a Traveler player. Which will destroy anything worth plundering long before the fortress is smashed. To take a fortified planet intact, or at least intact enough to be worth taking, the invader must not only enter the upper atmosphere, but deploy troops to the surface to dig the defenders out. So you can maybe blow it up, but if you want to actually have something left at the end, you're going to have to dig them out. Logistics, it's really all about fuel. And he says that. My lord, it's all about fuel. What matters most about a starship is its fuel. Guns, armors, and weapons allow you to fight a battle, my lord, but fuel allows you to fight a battle, but my lord, but fuel allows you, I think I missed part of the quote, allows you to get to where the battle is. The space between stars is so crushingly vast in the systems we inhabit, such tiny atolls amidst the void, that a fleet that wishes to avoid battle can do so indefinitely, unless and until it runs out of fuel. Here it's the paradox of the hyper-expansion drive. Only in the hardest of interstellar vacuum is the density matter low enough for a hex ship to reach full speed, but at such speeds, a ship will soon run out of fuel, and in space, there's nowhere to get more. And so only at worlds with liquid water or gaseous hydrogen can a ship refill its tanks, and it is precisely in the dust-laden space around such worlds that it must move most slowly. So I read you that part of the quote before. Thus, the first stage in any interstellar offensive must be to gather intelligence on places to refuel, looking not merely... okay, sorry about that. I screwed up that quote when I copied and pasted it. And I can't remember what the rest of that previous sentence was supposed to say. But it says that this is looking not merely to the suitability of infrastructure, but to the subvertibility of those who control it. That's what it's supposed to say. So sorry for screwing that up. So basically, it's like there's lots of court intrigue and et cetera, et cetera. Lots of people's minor nobles stabbing their feudal lord in the back and being paid to do so and stuff like that. And so that's one of the things that you do there. He also says that maintenance is really important. And this is part of like why you need to invest in having good crew. And it's specifically because of maintenance. A fighting starship, for all its armor, is a delicate assembly of complex parts, and something is always, always, always breaking down. The more powerful the ship, the weaker this Achilles heel, for it has more parts that can go wrong. You know, my guess is a ship that's a kilometer long has a lot of parts that can break. Indeed, since our greatest warships are those built centuries ago with high index art since lost, just to keep them functioning often stretches our current knowledge to its limit. Granted, my lord, ships built in the great days of the United Empire had automated diagnostics and maintenance systems, but those systems required human supervision even when new. And in these degenerate days, my lord, as I can tell you from bitter personal experience, there is no piece of technology more likely to break down than one that is supposed to repair itself. I love that quote. And then he solved a whole bunch of problems that you might have with just, self-repairing ships with that quote. And it's nice that works out. So that was the last slide in the presentation, except for a couple of pieces of artwork. So here's a piece of artwork from Void. There's a couple of things here from Void. And so that's a 3-engine ship, I think, on the left, and like a cruiser of some sort. And I forget what the other, I wasn't able to quite match the other two, but that's apparently what it looks like when they're in distortion drive. Here's another ship. I don't remember the context other than it was just a ship that fit on the slide well, so I decided to grab it and put it on the slide. I will admit that that I'm not as big a fan of the ship designs as I could be. I'm more a fan of the words that go behind the ship designs than I am of the ship designs themselves, and the stories are really pretty good too. And that's the last slide. So with that in mind, let me bring it back up here and let me go through and see about comments. Let's see. Already said hi to those folks. Scrolling. Mike DiCarlo says, what new job? Yeah, I'm not retiring. My plan is to work another 10 years. I'm not ready to retire. I'm just retiring from federal service because it's a good time to get out of federal service. In fact, let me put it back down here. Let me move this back down so I'm not staring into my upper monitor anymore. Let's see. Hello. Bob says liquid water is not required. Tech the sophisticated could use ice just as easily. Yes. Just depends on how impure it is, but there are many sources of pure ice similar to Saturn's ring. So yeah, from that standpoint, yeah, you can go and get stuff like that. He doesn't really talk about mining asteroids, mining comets and stuff like that as a fuel source. I think he talks about atmospheric processing, and because at some point he says it would take 8 days minimum. And in Void, there's a lot of counting how many days away you are from stuff and how long it's going to take to exfil and going to where the fuel is and how that constrains your movements. And it's a story worth reading. I don't want to get too deep in the details because I don't want to, there's spoilers there. But he does talk about what you would call frontier refueling in traveler terms. Okay, let's see. – 94th birthday to William Shatner. Happy birthday, Bill. Bill Ricker says hi, and then he'll come back and rewatch later. Okay, that's good, Bill. Eve Online also apparently has let me just throw Bob's comment up. Very complicated shield-based and armor-based mechanics, but attempting both on one ship means a very limited capability ship. Yeah, trade-offs are cool. Trade-offs are cool. Bob says it reminds him of the Kazinti. Yeah. It's like you can't get around your bad culture. Wright makes the comment that when he played Harpoon, he turned off the random equipment breakdowns because he's a Navy guy, and even though he knows that stuff breaks in the real world, he doesn't want to be reminded of it when he plays Harpoon. I can certainly believe that. That's one of the things that I always say is different about Star Trek. In the real U.S. Navy, sometimes you go to turn on a piece of gear and it just doesn't work, right? And we've all had that, right? Sometimes you go out to your car and your car doesn't start. Can you imagine? Do we ever see anything like that in Star Trek? The closest we get is things like an ion storm broke a bunch of shit. You don't see anything more than that. Mike DiCarlo says refueling sounds like recoaling. You have to add the time to refill the bunker, and you're sitting still, not ready for battle. Yeah, that's definitely true. In fact, if you go back and you look at how long it took to do coaling on something like the Titanic, it was like a week. It was several days to fill that thing with coal, because the coal came, by and large, the coal came in bags, if I remember correctly. He had to carry them on board. And I want to say, if I remember correctly, coaling took place through a chute that you had to remove a piece of the hull to get to on the Titanic. You had to basically take it out, and then you could put a chute up next to it, and you'd slide the coal down. If you're recoaling, there are other instances where you're coaling using bags. If you have to like coal between two ships that are out at sea, you put it in bags so that you can have guys like physically carry it. Let's see. So Wright talks about the transporter or the holodeck breaking. Bob also pushes back a little bit and says that they have breakdowns whenever the chief engineer needs to save the day. They don't just break as a general rule. Something happens to them. There is no equivalent of I went to start my car and it just wouldn't start and I didn't do anything. Well, and maybe the thing I didn't do was I didn't replace the battery on schedule. But you don't really have just like, yeah, we flipped it on and it didn't work. Sorry, boss. We'll get somebody on it as soon as we can. We got the parts on order. You just don't have stuff like that as a general rule. Deep Space Nine, O'Brien maybe had to deal with some of that stuff, but remember, that wasn't a Federation ship. That was Cardassian. Those guys are bozos. Yes, your equipment was built by the lowest bidder. Unrep for fuel is cinematic, but not viable in real world usage, I think. I think you mean like real world science fiction usage. Because in the real world, they do it. So my guess is you meant science fiction. So, okay, I can see that. Okay, all right. So I'm at the end of the comments, and I think it's time to go ahead and call it an evening. And once again, let me just say that I am honored that a bunch of you are willing to spend your Saturday night listening to me ramble about a graphic novel series that you probably haven't heard of before. I hope that some of you have decided that you need to rush out and buy it, because it is really cool. And I would really just like to thank you all for coming and spending your Saturday night with me. And as soon as I have some idea what my schedule is, hopefully next week I'll have a better idea what my schedule looks like, but it's going to be crazy for a little while. So thank you in advance for enduring that. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.